A wealthy man ignored a beggar asking for water, but the next day, he finds himself trapped in a desert with no one around to help him. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The sun bore down relentlessly on the gleaming glass facade of the Horizon Tech headquarters, the temperature display on the adjacent bank sign flashing an unforgiving 104-degree ISO. Richard Thornton stepped out of his custom Bentley, adjusting his Italian silk tie while continuing his phone conversation without missing a beat. Listen, Goldstein, their valuation is ridiculous. Offer them $30 million, not a penny more. Their technology is worth that at best, and they know it. Richard's voice was crisp, authoritative, accustomed to being obeyed. I don't care about their potential. We're buying what exists today, not fairy tales about tomorrow. As the valet took his keys with a deferential nod, Richard noticed a disheveled figure approaching from the corner of his eye. Frank Miller had positioned himself near the building's entrance, his weathered face lined with exhaustion, clothes dusty and worn thin from life on the streets. Frank's cracked lips parted as he gathered the courage to speak. "Excuse me, sir. Could I trouble you for some water? It's awfully hot today." Richard pivoted smoothly away without even making eye contact, continuing his conversation as if Frank were merely a piece of urban furniture, something to be navigated around rather than acknowledged. "No, Goldstein, we're not budging on the timeline either. I want the acquisition paperwork ready by Friday." He strode toward the revolving doors, leaving Frank standing there, invisible and unheard. The contrast between the scorching street and the perfectly climate-controlled lobby hit Richard like a physical wave, a daily reminder of his privileged position. Employees nodded respectfully as he crossed the marble expanse, though he noticed the tension in their smiles, the way conversations hushed as he passed. Good. A healthy dose of fear kept everyone performing at their peak. "Good morning, Mr. Thornton." His assistant materialized beside him, matching his brisk pace. "The board is assembled in the Skyline room. They're waiting for your presentation." "Any last-minute changes I should know about?" Richard asked, accepting the tablet she handed him. "No, sir. Everything is prepared exactly as you requested." The elevator whisked him to the top floor, its mirrored walls reflecting a man at the pinnacle of success. Tailored charcoal suit, salt and pepper hair perfectly groomed, the confident posture of someone who commanded rather than requested. At 52, Richard Thornton had built Horizon Tech from a promising startup into a technological juggernaut worth billions. Today was just another day of making the hard decisions that kept it that way. The Skyline room lived up to its name. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city Richard considered his personal chessboard. 8 board members sat around the polished conference table, their expressions a careful blank as he entered. "Let's not waste time," Richard said without preamble, activating the presentation screen with a tap. "The quarterly projections are concerning. Our growth has slowed to 6%, and shareholders are expecting 8%. He clicked through to a slide showing an organizational chart with one entire division highlighted in red. The Research Analytics Department has underperformed for 3 consecutive quarters. 78 employees, $12 million in annual overhead, and diminishing returns on investment. Richard's voice remained clinical, as if discussing the removal of a malfunctioning component rather than people with families and mortgages. "I'm shutting it down effective next week." The shock rippled visibly around the table. Martha Chen, the CFO, was the first to recover. "Richard, that's our most experienced research team. They've been with us since nearly the beginning." "Which is precisely the problem," Richard countered smoothly. "They've grown comfortable, complacent. Their innovation metrics have dropped 40% while their compensation has increased." James Whitaker, the silver-haired veteran who headed product development, leaned forward. "These are people who helped build this company. Couldn't we restructure instead? Perhaps reassign? The decision is made. Richard cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. The severance packages are generous. 3 months' salary, extended benefits. More than fair. The market doesn't reward sentiment, James. It rewards results. He flipped to the next slide, showing projections with the department removed. This puts us back on track for 8.5% growth. The shareholders get what they want, and we maintain our position as industry leaders. The remainder of the meeting proceeded with subdued discussion of implementation details. Richard noted who voiced concerns and who remained silent. Mental notes for future reference. Loyalty mattered, but not at the expense of vision. An hour later, Richard eased his Ferrari out of the executive parking garage, classical music filling the cabin as the air conditioning chased away the oppressive heat. His mind was already on tomorrow's shareholder presentation, mentally rehearsing how he would position the department closure as strategic streamlining rather than a cost-cutting measure. The gates of his hillside estate opened automatically as he approached, the sprawling modernist mansion perched above the city like a concrete and glass crown. Richard had designed it himself, a testament to his success visible from miles away. He was surprised to see Jason's electric motorcycle parked in the circular driveway. His 19-year-old son rarely came home these days, preferring the company of his university friends and whatever social causes currently captured his attention. Richard found Jason waiting in the living room, his lanky frame tense with barely contained anger. The boy had his mother's eyes, a reminder of the marriage that had collapsed under the weight of Richard's single-minded ambition years ago. "Hello, son. Unexpected visit. Everything all right at school?" Jason didn't return the greeting. "Is it true? You're firing an entire department?" Richard set down his briefcase, annoyed but unsurprised. News traveled fast, especially bad news. "It's a business decision, Jason. Sometimes difficult choices—" "Save it," Jason interrupted, thrusting his phone toward his father. The screen showed a social media post with hundreds of comments, all expressing outrage at Horizon Tech's impending layoffs. "It's already all over Twitter and LinkedIn. People are furious." Richard poured himself a scotch from the crystal decanter, unmoved. "Social media outrage has the attention span of a goldfish. Next week, they'll be angry about something else." "These are people's lives, Dad. Families who depend on those jobs. How can you be so cold about it?" "I'm protecting thousands of other jobs by ensuring the company remains profitable," Richard replied, his voice hardening. "That's what responsible leadership looks like." "Leadership?" Jason's laugh was bitter. "You used to talk about innovation and making the world better. What happened to that man? The one who taught me about integrity and treating people right?" "I grew up, Jason. I suggest you do the same." Richard took a deliberate sip of his scotch. "The world runs on profit and loss, not good intentions. You've become exactly what you used to mock, a corporate monster who only sees people as numbers on a spreadsheet." Jason threw his phone onto the leather sofa. "And it's not just employees who see it." Richard picked up the phone, frowning at a viral video playing on the screen. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. Richard outside Horizon Tech, ignoring Frank Miller's request for water before stepping into the building. The caption read, "Horizon Tech CEO too busy for basic human decency. Can't spare water for homeless man in 104-degree heat, but can cut 78 jobs to please shareholders. You're a corporate monster. Boycott Horizon Tech." The comments beneath were scathing, the hashtag already trending. "Where did this come from?" Richard demanded, scrolling through the mounting outrage. "Someone caught your moment of compassion on their phone," Jason replied acidly. "Congratulations, Dad. You're going viral for all the wrong reasons." Richard tossed the phone back onto the sofa dismissively. "This is meaningless noise. It will blow over." "Will it? Or is it showing everyone exactly who you've become?" Jason shook his head, the disappointment in his eyes cutting deeper than Richard would admit. Mom was right about you. There's nothing left of the man she married. Your mother made her choices just as I've made mine. Richard's voice was steel. Yeah, well, I'm making mine too. Jason headed for the door. I can't be around you when you're like this. Call me when my actual father returns. The door slammed with such force that the modern art piece on the adjacent wall tilted askew. Richard didn't move to straighten it, instead walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city that had made him rich and powerful. He sipped his scotch, watching the sun begin its descent, casting long shadows across the urban landscape. The viral video was an annoyance, but nothing more. Tomorrow's shareholder presentation was what mattered, showing strength, decisiveness, and an unwavering commitment to growth. Yet as the amber liquid burned down his throat, Richard couldn't completely dismiss the look in his son's eyes. It reminded him too much of another pair of eyes, his ex-wife's, the day she told him she no longer recognized the man she had married. Richard pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant. I need to clear my head before tomorrow's presentation, he said, his decision crystallizing. Prepare the helicopter for tomorrow morning. I want to see the Grand Canyon. Sir, there are weather alerts for that area. Possible sandstorms. Richard's jaw tightened. I don't care about the alerts. I'll be back in time for the evening presentation. Make it happen. He ended the call and turned back to the view, city lights beginning to twinkle on as dusk settled. A king surveying his domain, unaware that his reign was about to face its greatest challenge. The gleaming Bell 429 helicopter sat on the Horizon Tech Building's helipad, its rotors still as Richard approached through the morning haze. The sun had barely crested the horizon, bathing the city in a golden glow that did nothing to lighten Richard's mood. He'd slept poorly, dreams haunted by Jason's disappointed face and the viral video's comment section. Good morning, Mr. Thornton, the pilot called out, his expression professional but concerned. Beautiful day for flying, though I should mention again that the Weather Service has issued alerts for the Grand Canyon area, possibility of sudden sandstorms developing this afternoon. Richard waved away the concern with a dismissive hand. I've heard the warnings, Matthews. We'll be fine. This isn't my first helicopter ride. Of course, sir, Matthews replied, knowing better than to argue. We should be able to get you there and back, in plenty of time for your evening presentation. The flight plan is filed and we're cleared for takeoff. Richard settled into the luxurious leather seat, placing his briefcase on the adjacent seat. Inside was his tablet, containing tomorrow's presentation to the shareholders, which he planned to review during the flight. The helicopter's interior was a testament to corporate excess, custom upholstery, state-of-the-art communications equipment, and a small bar stocked with premium spirits. Not that Richard planned to drink before the presentation, but he appreciated the option. As Matthews went through his pre-flight checks, Richard's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Jason's name flashed on the screen, surprising him. Had his son calmed down and called to apologize for his outburst? After a moment's hesitation, Richard rejected the call, sending it to voicemail. Whatever Jason wanted to say could wait until after the presentation. Right now, Richard needed clarity, not another emotional conversation about corporate ethics from a teenager who'd never had to make a difficult business decision in his life. The helicopter's engines roared to life, drowning out the lingering guilt about ignoring his son's call. The vibrations ran through Richard's body as the rotors began their rhythmic chop, slicing through the morning air. Within moments, they were airborne, the city shrinking beneath them as Matthews guided the aircraft upward into the clear blue sky. Richard watched the urban landscape give way to suburbs, then to the arid terrain that surrounded the metropolis. The geographical transformation mirrored what he hoped to achieve with this trip: distance from the noise, perspective on the bigger picture. By the time he returned, the viral video would be yesterday's news, and he could focus on what truly mattered: keeping Horizon Tech at the cutting edge of innovation and profitability. Opening his tablet, Richard began reviewing the slides for his presentation. The numbers were impressive. 8 consecutive quarters of growth, market share expanding in key sectors, and a promising pipeline of new products. The closure of Research Analytics was a small price to pay for maintaining such momentum. The shareholders would understand. They spoke the same language of profit and loss. An hour into the flight, the landscape below had transformed completely. The city was long gone, replaced by the breathtaking expanse of desert and canyons. Richard had to admit there was something majestic about the untamed wilderness, nature's reminder that some things remained beyond human control. "We're approaching the eastern rim of the Grand Canyon, sir," Matthews announced through the intercom. "Visibility is excellent right now, but I'm picking up some concerning weather patterns developing to the west. The alert status has been upgraded." Richard looked up from his tablet, momentarily captivated by the magnificent chasm below, layer upon layer of red rock carved by millennia of flowing water, a testament to the power of persistence. "How serious is it?" Richard asked, reluctant to cut the trip short when they'd come this far. "National Weather Service is reporting increased risk of sudden sandstorms. They're advising all aircraft to avoid the area for the next 6 hours." Matthews' voice carried professional concern. "I recommend we turn back now, sir. We can still make it to Horizon Tech with plenty of time before your presentation." Richard checked his watch. It was barely past noon. "Let's continue for another 30 minutes, then head back. I want to see the western rim as well. With all due respect, Mr. Thornton, that's precisely the direction the storm system is developing." There was a new tension in the pilot's voice. 30 minutes, Matthews," Richard said firmly. "We have the most advanced helicopter in the Horizon Tech fleet. It can handle a little wind." Through the cockpit doorway, Richard could see Matthews' shoulders tense, but the pilot nodded once and adjusted their course. "Yes, sir," continuing to the western rim. Richard returned to his presentation, adding notes about how the department closure would free up resources for their quantum computing initiative. The shareholders would love that. Quantum was the buzzword of the year, promising computational power that would make today's technology look primitive. His phone buzzed again. Jason once more. This time Richard silenced the device entirely without looking at it. Whatever family drama his son wanted to discuss would have to wait. The first sign of trouble came 15 minutes later, a slight turbulence that caused Richard's tablet to slide off his lap. He caught it before it hit the floor, looking up with mild irritation. "Sorry about that, sir," Matthews called back. "We're hitting some rough air. I think we should turn back immediately." Before Richard could respond, his gaze was drawn to the window. The horizon, which had been crystal clear moments before, was now obscured by an ominous wall of swirling brown. The sandstorm wasn't developing. It had arrived, and with alarming speed. "How far are we from the edge of this?" Richard asked, his voice steady despite the sudden spike in his heartbeat. "That's the problem, sir," Matthews replied, hands moving rapidly across the controls. "It wasn't on the radar 5 minutes ago. These desert storms can form with almost no warning." The pilot was already banking the helicopter in a wide turn. "I'm taking us back now, but we'll need to find an alternative route. We can't outrun this." The helicopter shuddered, caught in increasingly violent air currents. Richard gripped his armrest, his presentation forgotten as he watched the wall of sand approaching with frightening speed. "Matthews, what are our options?" Richard's voice remained remarkably calm, the product of years navigating corporate crises. "I'm trying to climb above it, sir, but it's rising faster than—" The pilot's words were cut short as the helicopter gave a violent lurch, throwing Richard against his seatbelt. The sand hit them like a physical wall, enveloping the helicopter in a swirling maelstrom of brown and orange. Visibility dropped to 0 in seconds, the windows now showing nothing but a fury of dust particles bombarding the glass. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit panel. Richard could hear Matthews speaking urgently into his radio, requesting emergency assistance, providing coordinates, explaining their situation. The words, "instruments failing" and "disoriented," cut through the static. "What can I do?" Richard asked, leaning forward toward the cockpit. "Seatbelt tight, brace position," Matthews instructed tersely. "Something's wrong with the engines, sand in the intakes. We're losing altitude too quickly." Richard had faced corporate takeovers, market crashes, and technological revolutions without flinching, but nothing had prepared him for the sickening sensation of the helicopter dropping through the air. His stomach lurched as they lost altitude, the frame of the aircraft groaning under the stress. Through the howling wind and mechanical alarms, Richard caught fragments of Matthews's Mayday call. "Bell 429, caught in sudden sandstorm, instruments compromised, attempting emergency landing. Coordinates uncertain." Richard tried to access his phone, thinking irrationally of calling Jason, of saying something, anything, that might make amends for their last conversation. But the device slipped from his fingers as another violent jolt sent it skittering across the floor. "Brace for impact," Matthews shouted, his voice strained but professional to the end. "We're going down." The world became chaos, spinning, alarms blaring, the horrible sound of metal scraping and twisting. Richard caught a glimpse of the desert floor rushing up to meet them before closing his eyes, arms crossed protectively over his chest, head down. The impact was catastrophic. Metal tore and glass shattered. Richard felt his body slam against the restraints, then a searing pain in his leg before his head struck something hard. Darkness swallowed him instantly. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. Pain. Silence. The taste of dust and blood. Heat. Intense, oppressive heat. Richard opened his eyes to blurred vision and disorientation. The helicopter lay on its side, sunlight streaming through shattered windows, illuminating swirling dust particles. "Matthews?" Richard's voice emerged as a croak, his throat parched and raw. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, to make sense of the twisted metal surrounding him. Richard fumbled with his seatbelt, wincing as it released, and he fell awkwardly against what was now the floor of the cabin. Pain shot through his right leg, and he looked down to see his expensive trousers torn and stained with blood from a gash across his thigh. "Matthews!" he called again, louder this time, dragging himself toward the cockpit. The sight that greeted him extinguished any remaining hope. Matthews was still strapped into his seat, but his body hung at an unnatural angle, neck broken by the impact. The pilot's eyes stared sightlessly at the shattered instrument panel, his final expression frozen in concentration. "No," Richard whispered, reaching out to check for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. "God, no." The full reality of his situation crashed down on Richard with more force than the helicopter had hit the ground. He was stranded in the desert. No pilot. No radio. The communications equipment was smashed beyond recognition. No rescue on the way. They deviated from their flight plan, and the sandstorm would have obscured their emergency descent. Richard pulled himself back into the cabin, desperately searching for his phone. He found it beneath a twisted piece of metal, the screen shattered, the device as dead as Matthews. Panic threatened to overwhelm him until years of corporate crisis management kicked in. Assess the situation, inventory resources, develop a plan. Richard forced himself to breathe deeply, to think methodically. Water. He needed water first. The helicopter had an emergency kit. All corporate aircraft did. Richard found it partially crushed beneath a collapsed storage compartment. Inside, a first aid kit, some emergency rations, and a small flask of water, barely enough for a day in this heat. Richard uncapped the flask with shaking hands, about to take a desperate gulp, when sanity prevailed. He forced himself to take only a small sip, just enough to wet his parched mouth. The water was warm but felt like salvation against his cracked lips. As he carefully recapped the flask, saving every precious drop, Richard's gaze fell on Matthew's lifeless form again. The reality of his predicament hit him with brutal clarity. He was injured, alone in a vast desert, with almost no water, no communications, and no one looking for him in the right place. Examining the small flask more carefully, Richard realized with growing horror that it was barely a quarter full, just a few swallows of water at most. The impact must have cracked it, allowing most of the contents to leak out among the wreckage. Richard stared at the nearly empty water flask in his hands, the cruel reality of his situation sinking in with each passing second. Only a few precious swallows remained, barely enough to moisten his lips in this merciless heat. His survival training was limited to corporate takeovers and boardroom battles, not desert wastelands, where the sun turned sand into a scorching griddle. "Think, Richard. Think," he muttered, carefully securing the flask in his breast pocket. With methodical precision born from years of crisis management, Richard turned to assess the helicopter wreckage. The once pristine Bell 429 lay twisted and broken, its gleaming shell now a jumble of torn metal and shattered glass. Sand had already begun infiltrating the cabin through the broken windows, nature reclaiming the intrusion with silent efficiency. Richard winced as he attempted to stand, the gash in his leg sending waves of pain through his body. Using a first aid kit from the emergency supplies, he fashioned a makeshift bandage from his silk shirt, tearing the $600 garment without hesitation. The shirt's delicate fabric was poorly suited for wound care, but it would have to do. "Matthews deserved better," Richard said softly, looking at the pilot's body still strapped in the cockpit. There was no way to bury him, no way to protect him from the elements. All Richard could do was close the man's unseeing eyes and whisper a hurried apology for ignoring the warnings, for the arrogance that had brought them here. Searching through the debris, Richard assembled what little could be salvaged: his cracked tablet with a dead battery, a leather portfolio containing shareholder presentations, and his designer suit jacket. The irony wasn't lost on him. Documents worth billions to his corporation, but worthless in his current predicament. The heat inside the wrecked helicopter had become unbearable, the metal frame turning the cabin into an oven. Richard knew he couldn't stay. He had to find civilization, or at least signal for help. With the jacket draped over his head as protection from the relentless sun, Richard stepped out of the wreckage. The landscape that greeted him was both breathtaking and terrifying. Miles of undulating sand and stone stretching to the horizon in every direction, shimmering under the punishing sun. Not a road, building, or power line in sight. Richard checked his luxury wristwatch, a titanium Patek Philippe that cost more than what most of his employees earned in a year. It was 11:37 a.m. The temperature had to be well over 100 degrees, and it would only get hotter as midday approached. Shielding his eyes, Richard scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of civilization. He needed to orient himself to form a plan. To the east, where they had come from, lay more desert. To the west, where they had been heading, the terrain appeared slightly different. More rocky outcroppings, what might be the rim of the canyon. North, Richard decided, based on nothing more than the vague memory of a map he'd once glanced at. Civilization should be north. He took a single small sip of water, barely wetting his tongue, before carefully sealing the flask. Then, with a determination that had built a technology empire, Richard Thornton began to walk. The first hour was deceptively manageable. Despite his injured leg, Richard maintained a steady pace, his mind calculating distances and time frames as if planning a business strategy. Someone would realize he was missing. A search would begin. All he needed to do was survive until then. By the second hour, reality had begun to assert itself. The gash in his leg throbbed with each step. His designer shoes, perfect for boardroom floors, blistered his feet on the rough terrain. The suit jacket offered minimal protection from the sun, and sweat soaked through his remaining clothes. Still, Richard pressed on. Forward progress, he muttered through cracked lips. Always forward. His Patek Philippe now read 1:45 p.m., the hottest part of the day. Richard allowed himself another tiny sip of water, rationing it with the same discipline he applied to company resources during lean times. In the distance, a dark line appeared on the horizon. Richard's heart leaped. "A road," he whispered, hope surging through his exhausted body. It has to be a road. With renewed energy, Richard increased his pace, ignoring the pain shooting up from his injured leg. The dark line remained frustratingly distant, but it was there, a promise of salvation, of connection to the world he knew. Time became elastic, stretching and contracting with each painful step. The watch read 3:30 p.m. when Richard paused to catch his breath. The dark line seemed no closer, a cruel trick of distance and desert light. But it was real. It had to be real. Just keep moving, he told himself. One step at a time. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Richard's silk-wrapped leg wound had started bleeding again, leaving a faint trail of red droplets on the sand behind him. His throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper, but he resisted the urge to drink more water. Finally, as the light began to fade, the dark line grew more distinct. Richard's pace quickened despite his exhaustion. It was so close now, just another half-mile, perhaps less. When he finally reached it, the truth hit him with crushing force. What he had thought was a road was nothing more than a dry riverbed, a natural depression in the desert floor where water might flow during the rare desert rains. Not a road, not salvation, just another feature in the endless, indifferent landscape. Richard fell to his knees in the cracked mud of the riverbed, a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob escaping his parched throat. All that effort, all that hope, for nothing. The reality of his situation pressed down on him like a physical weight. He was lost in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, with almost no water, no communications, and an injury that was steadily worsening. The mighty Richard Thornton, CEO of Horizon Tech, whose decisions affected thousands of lives, whose wealth could buy almost anything, reduced to a desperate man kneeling in the dirt. As the last of the daylight began to fade, Richard looked up at the darkening sky. The first stars were becoming visible, pinpricks of light in the deepening blue. In the city, light pollution obscured all but the brightest stars. Here, they emerged by the thousands, a spectacular display of cosmic scale that made Richard feel smaller than he had ever felt before. "What would Jason think if he could see me now?" Richard whispered to the empty desert. His son's angry words echoed in his memory. "You've become exactly what you used to mock, a corporate monster." Was that true? Had he lost something essential in his relentless pursuit of success? Richard's thoughts turned to Frank Miller, the homeless man he had dismissed without a second thought. What would it have cost him to stop, to acknowledge the man's humanity, to offer him water? Water. The thought triggered another wave of thirst. Richard allowed himself another tiny sip from the flask, the warm liquid barely enough to moisten his tongue. He had to find more water soon, or all the wealth and power in the world wouldn't save him. With night fully descended, the temperature began to drop rapidly. The desert that had been an oven during the day was quickly becoming a refrigerator. Richard pulled his jacket on properly, grateful now for the fine wool that had seemed so inappropriate earlier. His watch glowed in the darkness. 8:17 p.m. Richard calculated that he had been walking for nearly 7 hours, covering perhaps 5 miles given his injury and the difficult terrain. Not nearly enough to reach civilization, but enough to make returning to the helicopter impossible. He was committed now. Forward was the only option. The riverbed offered at least some shelter from the wind that had begun to pick up, carrying a chill that cut through Richard's sweat-dampened clothes. He found a hollow beneath a slight overhang and curled up as best he could, using his leather portfolio as a minimal cushion against the hard ground. Exhaustion pulled at him, but Richard fought to stay awake, to think, to plan. Someone would be looking for him by now. Jason would have raised the alarm when Richard missed his presentation and didn't answer calls. Search parties would be organized. Helicopters with infrared cameras could spot a human heat signature even in the vast desert. All he had to do was survive until they found him. As Richard finally surrendered to fitful sleep, his dreams were haunted by boardroom faces, executives he had fired, competitors he had crushed, employees he had never bothered to know. And floating above them all, the weathered face of Frank Miller, asking again for water that Richard had refused to give. Morning came with brutal swiftness, the sun cresting the horizon to begin another day of merciless heat. Richard awoke disoriented, momentarily believing he was in his king-sized bed at home, before reality crashed back with painful clarity. His mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton, his lips cracked and bleeding. The wound on his leg had stiffened overnight, making it even more painful to move. When Richard checked the water flask, the remaining liquid looked pitifully inadequate against the long day ahead. Standing was an exercise in willpower, each movement sending fresh pain through his battered body. Richard's once immaculate appearance was now a distant memory, his remaining clothes torn and filthy, his face sunburned and stubbled, his hands blistered and cut. Orientation, Richard muttered, forcing himself to think systematically. Need to maintain direction. The rising sun provided a clear indication of east. If civilization lay to the north, as he believed, Richard needed to keep the sun on his right as he walked. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all he had. The second day of walking proved infinitely harder than the first. Without the adrenaline that had sustained him initially, each step became a negotiation with his failing body. The heat built quickly, the temperature soaring past 100 degrees before mid-morning. Richard allowed himself one more precious sip of water, knowing he was approaching the end of his supply. The liquid barely registered against his overwhelming thirst, like trying to extinguish a forest fire with an eyedropper. As he staggered forward, the desert around him began to waver and distort in the heat. Mirages appeared and disappeared, shimmering pools of non-existent water that vanished as he approached. But one vision remained persistent, a figure in the distance, standing impossibly still in the heat. Richard blinked hard, trying to clear his vision. The figure remained, a man holding what appeared to be a glass of water. As the shape became clearer, Richard felt a chill despite the blistering heat. It was Frank Miller, the homeless man from outside Horizon Tech, standing in the middle of the desert with a cool glass of water extended toward Richard. Richard staggered forward, reaching out with trembling hands toward the figure of Frank Miller. The homeless man stood there impassively, holding a glass of water that caught the sunlight, droplets of condensation running down its sides in tantalizing rivulets. "Please," Richard croaked, his voice barely audible even to himself. "Water. I need water." Frank's weathered face remained impassive as Richard stumbled closer. The mirage was so detailed. Every line on Frank's face, the frayed edges of his worn jacket, even the slight tremor in his outstretched hand holding the glass. When Richard was just steps away, his fingers nearly touching the promised relief, Frank's form dissipated like smoke, leaving Richard clutching at empty desert air. The crushing disappointment brought him to his knees, a sob catching in his parched throat. "Not real," he whispered, pounding a fist weakly against the scorching sand. "Not real." Rising on unsteady legs, Richard turned in a complete circle, scanning the endless horizon. The vastness of his isolation struck him anew, a tiny human speck in an indifferent wasteland. He let out a cry that was part rage, part desperation, the sound swallowed immediately by the empty landscape. "Help!" he shouted, his voice cracking painfully. "Is anyone there? Help!" Only silence answered him, broken by the faint whisper of wind across sand. Richard's shoulders slumped as the futility of his shouting became apparent. Sound didn't travel far in this open space, and there was no one to hear it anyway. The brilliant blue sky above him was completely empty. No planes, no helicopters, no sign of the civilization he had taken for granted his entire life. The search parties he had convinced himself would come seemed increasingly like another desert mirage, a comforting illusion born of desperation. As the afternoon wore on, Richard's pace slowed to little more than a shuffle. Each step required conscious effort, his injured leg dragging behind him, leaving a shallow furrow in the sand. The silk bandage had long since dried to the wound, crusty with blood and dirt. The hallucinations became more frequent. Frank appeared again and again, always with water, always vanishing when Richard got close. Sometimes Frank wore a Horizon Tech employee badge. Other times he wore a business suit similar to Richard's own. Each apparition felt more real than the last, the line between reality and delusion blurring under the relentless sun. "Why are you here?" Richard asked one of the mirages. "Why you, of all people?" The apparition of Frank tilted its head slightly, as if considering the question. "You know why," it replied, the voice sounding as real as anything in this nightmare. "I asked you for water. You didn't even see me." "I was busy," Richard protested weakly. "Important business." "And now?" The mirage gestured at the empty desert. "Is your business still important?" Before Richard could answer, the vision dissolved, leaving him talking to empty air. The conversation, real or imagined, filled him with unease. Was his dehydrated mind trying to tell him something? As the merciless sun finally began its descent, the heat gradually gave way to the first hints of evening coolness. Richard's watch, the only luxury item still functioning, showed 6:23 p.m. He had been walking for nearly 10 hours with minimal rest, fueled by nothing but determination and fear. The temperature dropped with surprising speed once the sun disappeared below the horizon. Within an hour, Richard found himself shivering, the same sun-baked sand that had burned through his shoes, now radiating cold into his aching body. The stars emerged in their full desert glory, a spectacular canopy of light that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. Instead, their cold, distant glitter only emphasized Richard's isolation. The nearly full moon cast enough light to create strange shadows among the rock formations, transforming the landscape into something alien and threatening. Richard found a small depression between two boulders that offered some protection from the wind. Using his jacket as both cushion and blanket, he curled into a tight ball, trying to conserve body heat. His throat burned with thirst, but the water flask contained only a final swallow, his emergency reserve that he couldn't bring himself to use yet. Just as exhaustion began to pull him toward unconsciousness, a distinct sound broke the desert silence. A soft, rhythmic rattling. Richard froze, instantly alert. The sound came again, closer this time. Slowly, careful not to make sudden movements, he turned his head toward the source. In the moonlight, barely 6 feet away, a rattlesnake watched him with unblinking eyes, its coiled body tense and ready to strike. "Don't move," Richard whispered to himself, heart pounding painfully against his ribs. "Stay perfectly still." The snake continued its warning rattle, neither advancing nor retreating. Richard's mind raced through fragmented knowledge of desert survival. Rattlesnakes were not typically aggressive unless threatened, but in the confines of the small space between the rocks, it might feel cornered. With excruciating slowness, Richard reached for his suit jacket, keeping his eyes on the snake. One sudden move could trigger a strike. The expensive wool garment that had once symbolized his status was now his only shield against venomous fangs. The snake tensed as Richard gradually unfolded the jacket. He could see its muscles rippling beneath diamond-patterned skin, ready to launch forward. "Easy," Richard breathed, barely audible. "Easy now." In one fluid motion, he flung the jacket over the snake, immediately scrambling backward out of the rocky shelter. The rattling became frantic under the fabric, then silence. Richard didn't wait to see what happened next, putting as much distance between himself and the rocks as his injured leg would allow. Without the minimal shelter of the boulders, Richard was now fully exposed to the frigid night air. He wrapped his arms around himself, teeth chattering uncontrollably. His jacket, his only protection against the cold, was now a sacrificial offering to a rattlesnake. "Just like the B. Bancroft acquisition," Richard stammered through chattering teeth, a hysterical edge to his voice. Sometimes you have to sacrifice something valuable to survive." The absurdity of comparing corporate strategy to his current situation struck him suddenly, and Richard found himself laughing, a dry, painful sound that held no humor. Was this what his life had come to? Desert analogies for business deals as he slowly died of exposure and dehydration? The night stretched endlessly, each minute an eternity of cold and discomfort. Richard walked in circles to keep his blood flowing, watching the stars rotate slowly overhead. His thoughts drifted to Jason. Had his son raised the alarm? Did he regret their last angry exchange? Or was he perhaps relieved to be free of his father's overbearing presence? When the eastern sky finally began to lighten, Richard greeted the dawn with ambivalence. The coming heat would end the bone-deep cold, but would bring its own deadly challenges. His resources were all but exhausted. No water, no protection from the sun, diminishing strength. As the first rays touched the desert floor, Richard allowed himself the final swallow from his water flask. The lukewarm liquid was the most exquisite thing he had ever tasted, and gone far too quickly. He tucked the empty container back into his pocket. A useless gesture, but he couldn't bring himself to discard it. With the new day came fresh hallucinations, more vivid than before. This time, Frank wasn't alone. He was joined by other familiar faces. Martha Chen from finance, whose department Richard had slashed the previous quarter. James Whitaker, who had disagreed with Richard's aggressive expansion plans and been edged into early retirement. Dozens of Horizon Tech employees whose careers and livelihoods had been sacrificed on the altar of corporate efficiency. They surrounded Richard in a wide circle, each holding a glass of crystal-clear water. "Please." Richard sank to his knees, reaching out to them. "I understand now. I was wrong. Just give me water. Please." The apparitions watched him impassively, neither approaching nor retreating. When Richard crawled toward them, they dissolved one by one, leaving him alone once more in the indifferent desert. "I'll do anything," he shouted at the empty air, his voice a ragged scrape of sound. "Whatever you want. Just help me." His only answer was the growing heat of the morning sun. As midday approached, Richard's orientation began to fail. He found himself walking in circles, following mirages that led nowhere. His earlier methodical approach had crumbled under the weight of dehydration and fatigue. The gash in his leg had begun to show angry red streaks climbing toward his knee, infection setting in, adding fever to his growing list of problems. During a moment of clarity, Richard noticed something in his jacket pocket that he'd overlooked, a small photograph, its edges worn from years of being carried. He pulled it out carefully, squinting at it through sun-damaged eyes. The image showed a much younger Richard and a small boy at a lakeside, fishing rods in hand, both grinning widely at the camera. Jason, at 7 years old, gap-toothed and jubilant over catching his first base. Richard's arm was around his son's shoulders, his face shining with a pride and joy that felt alien to the man he had become. Richard sank down onto the hot sand, staring at the photograph. Tears cut tracks through the dust on his cheeks, falling onto the image of happier times. "What happened to that man?" he whispered, tracing his younger self's face with a trembling finger. "Where did he go?" The memory came back with startling clarity, Jason tugging at his sleeve after they'd packed up their fishing gear, asking with bright-eyed hope, "Can we come back next weekend, Dad? Please?" Richard had ruffled his son's hair absently, already checking emails on his phone. "Maybe, buddy, if I'm not too busy." How many maybes had become permanent no's over the years? How many moments with his son had been sacrificed for conference calls, business deals, and endless work that now seemed so utterly meaningless? The photograph blurred as more tears fell. Richard carefully tucked it back into his pocket, close to his heart. "I'm sorry, Jason," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." With renewed determination born of regret, Richard forced himself to stand. He had to survive, not for Horizon Tech, not for the shareholders, but for the chance to tell his son he was sorry, to try, however feebly, to become again the man in that photograph. The afternoon heat reached its peak as Richard continued his uncertain journey. Each step was a negotiation with his failing body, each breath a struggle in the scorching air. The horizon wavered and danced before his eyes, making orientation nearly impossible. Then he saw it, a wooden structure in the distance, solid-looking even through the heat distortion. A ranger station? It had to be. Civilization at last. Richard redirected his faltering steps toward the structure, hope providing a final surge of energy. As he drew closer, he could make out details. A porch, windows, what looked like a radio antenna on the roof. Help was within reach. "I'm coming," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm almost there." Upon the distant horizon, Richard spotted what appeared to be a metal reflection, catching the sunlight. The wreckage of another vehicle lost in the desert, a promise of possible salvation, or perhaps just another cruel mirage. Richard dragged himself toward the glinting metal, each step a small victory against the crushing fatigue that threatened to bring him to his knees. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, but the promise of finding something, anything, that wasn't endless sand and rock propelled him forward with renewed determination. "Please be real," he whispered through cracked lips. "Just this once, please be real." As the distance closed, relief washed over him. Unlike the countless mirages that had tormented him throughout the day, the metal object maintained its solidity. It wasn't water his mind had conjured from desperation, but the unmistakable outline of a vehicle, or what remained of one. The Jeep sat half buried in sand, its once green paint faded to a pale ghost by years of sun exposure. Rust had claimed most of the metal surfaces, transforming the vehicle into an almost organic part of the landscape, as if the desert were slowly digesting it. "Hello?" Richard called out, his voice barely audible even to himself. "Anyone here?" Only the whisper of wind answered him, confirming what he already knew. This vehicle had been abandoned long ago. Still, it represented the first tangible evidence that other humans had passed this way, that he wasn't traversing some forgotten corner of the earth where no one would ever find him. Richard reached the Jeep and placed his hand against its sun-heated frame, the metal hot enough to burn. The vehicle listed to one side, its tires long since rotted away, axles sunk deep into the sand. The windshield was a spiderweb of cracks, most of the glass fallen away, and the seats inside were bleached, nearly white, their upholstery shredded by time and elements. With a grunt of effort, Richard pulled at the driver's side door. It resisted, hinges frozen with rust, before giving way with a screech that seemed obscenely loud in the desert silence. A small avalanche of sand cascaded from the door's interior as it swung open. "Water," Richard muttered, the single word encompassing his only priority, as he began to search the vehicle's interior. There has to be something. The Jeep's cabin was a time capsule of abandonment. Sand had infiltrated every surface, piling in drifts across the floorboards and filling the cracks between seats. The steering wheel's plastic covering had cracked and peeled away, and the dashboard instruments were sun-faded beyond recognition. Richard checked under seats in the back cargo area, anywhere that might have contained emergency supplies or, miracle of miracles, a forgotten canteen. His search yielded nothing but more sand, and the skeletal remains of what might have been a rodent that had sought shelter in the wrong place. Disappointment crashed through him. He slumped against the doorframe, the momentary energy surge from his discovery evaporating. What had he expected? That after all these years, this wreck would somehow contain a pristine bottle of water waiting just for him? As he was about to push himself away from the vehicle, his eye caught something. A small compartment in the dashboard, its door hanging slightly ajar. The glove box. He hadn't checked the glove box. With trembling fingers, Richard pulled it open. More sand spilled out, along with a few faded papers, vehicle registration documents from 15 years ago, and a small, leather-bound book. No water, no salvation, just an old notebook that someone had left behind. Richard picked up the book anyway. It was something human in this inhuman landscape, a connection, however tenuous, to another person. The leather cover was cracked and stiff, but had protected the pages inside reasonably well. Opening it carefully, Richard found himself looking at a handwritten journal. The first entry was dated June 17, 2008. The ink faded, but still legible. "Day 1 of my Southwest business trip," Richard read aloud, his voice a rasping whisper. "Decided to take a scenic detour through the desert. GPS shows a shortcut that should save an hour to my meeting in Phoenix. Sharon would call this another example of my impatience. She's probably right." Richard turned the page, oddly captivated despite his dire situation. The next entry described the writer's growing concern as his GPS led him further into uninhabited terrain, followed by panic when the Jeep hit a rock and punctured its oil pan. June 18th, vehicle disabled, no cell service. Tried. Walking east toward the highway, but had to turn back. Distances here are deceptive. Water running low already. We'll try again tomorrow, earlier before the heat. The entries continued, documenting a struggle for survival that mirrored Richard's own, with eerie precision. The writer had lasted longer than Richard had so far, nearly a week according to the dates, but the deterioration was clear in both the content and the increasingly shaky handwriting. What struck Richard most, however, were the reflections that began to appear between pragmatic notes about water rationing and failed attempts to signal passing aircraft. June 21st. Thinking about Sharon and the kids constantly. Funny how clear things become out here. All those late nights at the office, all those missed soccer games and dance recitals. For what? More money we didn't need? A bigger title on my business card? Richard felt a chill despite the heat. The words could have been pulled from his own thoughts over the past days. The final entries were difficult to read, the handwriting deteriorating into a barely legible scrawl as dehydration and exposure took their toll. June 23rd. Water gone since yesterday. Can't walk anymore. Keeping this journal in hopes someone finds it, tells Sharon and the children I was thinking of them at the end. All those years chasing success, and only now do I understand what wealth truly means. Not the corner office or the stock options or the vacation home. Just one more day with my family. Just one more chance to say I love you. Just one more. The entry ended mid-sentence. Richard closed the journal, a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with dehydration. The writer had died here, alone in this metal coffin, just as Richard himself might soon die. As he was about to place the journal back in the glove compartment, a photograph slipped from between its pages, falling onto the sand-covered floor of the Jeep. Richard picked it up gingerly, the paper brittle with age. The image showed a family. A man in his 40s standing proudly in a business suit, arm around a smiling woman, 2 children in front of them, beaming at the camera. A typical family portrait, the kind found in thousands of suburban homes. But as Richard studied the man's face, a jolt of recognition shot through him. The features were younger, healthier, unweathered by years of hardship, but unmistakable nonetheless. The same eyes, the same jawline. It was Frank Miller, the homeless man Richard had dismissed outside Horizon Tech. "Impossible," Richard whispered, his mind struggling to process this cosmic coincidence. Was this another hallucination? His brain creating connections that didn't exist? He flipped the photograph over. On the back, in faded handwriting, was scrawled, "Frank's Promotion Celebration, WaterTech Industries, 2007. Richard stared at the image again, then back at the journal. The man who had written these pages, who had died in this very spot, was Frank Miller. Or at least, the man Frank Miller had been before life had stripped everything away from him. The implications were too staggering for Richard's dehydrated mind to fully comprehend. Had Frank somehow survived, found his way back to civilization only to lose everything else? Or was this another Frank Miller entirely, and Richard's mind was creating connections out of coincidence? Before he could ponder further, a change in the air caught his attention. The light had shifted, taking on a strange amber quality. Richard glanced up through the broken windshield and felt his heart sink. On the horizon, a massive wall of swirling sand was approaching, another sandstorm, far larger than anything he had seen yet. The sight was both terrifying and majestic, a roiling cloud that seemed to reach from the ground to the sky, devouring the landscape as it advanced. "No, no, no," Richard muttered, panic rising in his throat. In his current weakened state, exposure to such a storm would almost certainly be fatal. He glanced frantically around the wrecked Jeep, assessing its potential as shelter. Despite its deteriorated condition, it was still more protection than being completely exposed on the desert floor. He had perhaps 15 minutes before the storm hit, not enough time to find better shelter, even if he had the strength to run. Richard quickly gathered the journal and photograph, securing them in his pocket alongside his own photo of Jason. Then he set about preparing the Jeep as best he could, using pieces of the rotted upholstery to plug the largest gaps in the windows and doors. The storm hit with devastating force, sending the temperature plummeting as the sun was blotted out. Sand poured through every crack and crevice of the Jeep, despite Richard's efforts, filling the air with choking dust. He pulled his tattered shirt up over his nose and mouth, curling into the most protected corner of the back seat. The wind howled like a living thing, rocking the Jeep on its axles. Richard could hear debris, small rocks, branches, perhaps pieces of the Jeep itself, being torn away by the force of the storm. The sound was deafening, a constant roar punctuated by sharp impacts against the vehicle's shell. For hours, Richard huddled in the darkness, time losing all meaning as the storm raged around him. He clutched the journals and photographs to his chest, these small tokens of humanity, his only comfort in the chaos. When the storm finally began to subside, Richard cautiously uncurled from his protective position. The interior of the Jeep was transformed, new drifts of sand covering everything, including Richard himself. He brushed it from his clothes and hair, coughing as the fine particles invaded his lungs. As he shifted position, Richard felt a moment of panic. Something was missing. The familiar weight in his pocket was gone. With desperate hands, he searched his clothing, then the sand around him. The water flask, his empty water flask, the one he had been carrying as a talisman of hope, was gone, either buried somewhere in the new sand or carried away by the storm. It was a small loss in practical terms, but it hit Richard with surprising force. That flask had been his lifeline, a symbol of his determination to survive, even when empty. Crawling from the Jeep into the post-storm landscape, Richard found a world transformed. Dunes had shifted, landmarks erased, the terrain rendered alien once more. Even his own footprints leading to the Jeep had been wiped away, as if he had materialized in this spot, rather than struggled his way here. As Richard examined the photograph again, he turned it over and discovered an inscription on the back, faded but still legible. Frank Miller, Research Director, Horizon Technologies, 2010. The name of the company Richard would found 3 years later. Richard stared at the faded inscription on the back of the photograph, his mind struggling to process the impossible connection. Frank Miller had worked for Horizon Technologies, a company that didn't exist until Richard himself founded it 3 years later. "That can't be right," he muttered, turning the photo over again to study Frank's face. The desert must be playing tricks on his mind. Dehydration was known to cause confusion. Yet the inscription was clear despite its age. Frank Miller, Research Director, Horizon Technologies, 2010. Richard carefully tucked the photograph back into his pocket alongside the one of himself and Jason. The coincidence was too strange, too perfect. Was his guilt-ridden mind manufacturing connections that weren't there? Or was some cosmic force orchestrating an elaborate lesson in humility? The storm had passed, but its effects lingered in the transformed landscape and the fine dust that hung in the air, giving the morning sun a sickly yellow tinge. Richard's mouth felt like it was lined with sandpaper, his tongue swollen and useless. It had been over 24 hours since his last drop of water, and he knew the human body couldn't survive much longer without it. His fever from the infected leg wound was worsening, adding delirious waves of heat and chill to his other miseries. Richard pulled himself to his feet, leaning heavily against the rusted jeep. He needed to keep moving. Staying meant certain death. "North," he whispered, orienting himself by the sun. "Still go north." He had taken only 3 steps when the first major hallucination of the day appeared. Frank Miller sat beneath a non-existent tree, looking comfortable and untroubled by the heat. Unlike the previous visions, this Frank was clean-shaven and well-dressed, matching the man from the photograph rather than the homeless person Richard had encountered. "You're looking rough, Richard," the hallucination said conversationally. "Here, have some water." Frank extended a crystal tumbler filled with ice and clear water, the kind Richard would have been served in his corner office. Richard knew it wasn't real, but found himself stumbling toward it anyway, desperate enough to chase mirages. As he reached for the glass, Frank's image wavered and transformed. In his place sat Martha Chen, Horizon Tech's CFO, whom Richard had berated in front of the entire board for questioning his layoff decisions. "Water, Mr. Thornton?" she asked, her voice professionally pleasant, but her eyes cold. "Or would you prefer to cut my department's budget again?" Richard froze, arms still extended. "You're not real," he managed to say. "Neither is your concern for your employees," Martha replied, the glass in her hand evaporating into the dry air. "We were always just numbers to you, weren't we?" Before Richard could respond, Martha's form dissolved, only to be replaced by James Whitaker, the veteran executive who had tried to defend the research team. "They had families, Richard," Whitaker's apparition said sadly. "Mortgages, children in college, dreams." One by one, the hallucinations multiplied. Faces of employees Richard had fired over. The years, each offering water that disappeared when he reached for it. They formed a circle around him, a silent jury of the discarded. "Please," Richard fell to his knees in the sand, the fever and dehydration overwhelming his remaining strength. "Just one drink. I understand now. I was wrong about all of it." The apparitions watched him impassively, neither helping nor leaving, until Richard collapsed face first into the sand. The grit filled his mouth, and he spat weakly, rolling onto his back to stare at the merciless sky. "I'll do anything," he whispered to the empty air. "Whatever it takes. Just help me live through this." The visions faded, leaving Richard alone once more, with only the sound of his labored breathing for company. After several minutes of gathering what little strength remained, he forced himself back to his feet. Standing took tremendous effort, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through his infected leg. As Richard resumed his journey northward, his hand brushed against something in his jacket's inner pocket, a small object he hadn't noticed before. Frowning, he reached in and pulled out a photograph, different from the ones he had examined earlier. This image was cracked and faded, but unmistakable. Richard and Jason fishing together at Lake Tahoe when the boy was 7. They were both grinning widely, Jason proudly holding up a small base, Richard's arm draped across his son's shoulders. It had been one of their rare father-son trips, a weekend Richard had nearly canceled for a business emergency, but, for once, had prioritized his child instead. Richard couldn't remember putting this photograph in his jacket. Perhaps it had been there for years, forgotten in an inner pocket of a suit he rarely wore. The coincidence of finding it now seemed like another desert miracle, or perhaps a cosmic taunt about what he stood to lose. Sinking onto a nearby rock, Richard held the photograph with trembling hands. The image blurred as tears formed in his eyes, the first moisture they had produced in days. "I forgot," he whispered to the image of his younger self. "I forgot what mattered." The memory surged back with startling clarity, Jason bouncing with excitement as they packed up their fishing gear, tugging at Richard's sleeve. "Can we come back next weekend, Dad? Please? This was the best day ever." Richard had ruffled his son's hair absently, already checking his BlackBerry for emails. "Maybe, buddy, if I'm not too busy with work." But there had been no next weekend. There had been an acquisition to finalize, then a product launch, then a board retreat. One, maybe next time, had become a lifetime of missed opportunities, culminating in the anger and disappointment on Jason's face during their last conversation. Richard traced his son's face in the photograph with a cracked fingertip. How many soccer games had he missed? How many school plays had he arrived at just in time to see the curtain call? How many dinners had grown cold while he took just one more call? "I'm sorry, Jason," he whispered, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on his cheeks. "I'm so sorry." Carefully tucking the photograph back into his pocket, Richard rose with renewed determination. He had to survive, not for Horizon Tech, not for his wealth or status, but for the chance to tell his son he was sorry. To try, in whatever time he had left, to become the father Jason deserved. The afternoon sun beat down with particular viciousness as Richard continued his desperate journey. Each step was a negotiation with his failing body, each breath a battle against the scorching air. The horizon wavered and danced before his eyes, making orientation nearly impossible. In the distance, a structure suddenly appeared, solid-looking even through the heat distortion. A building with walls and a roof. A ranger station? It had to be. Civilization at last. "Thank God," Richard gasped, changing direction toward the structure. Hope provided a final surge of energy as he stumbled forward, drawn by the promise of salvation. As he drew closer, details emerged. Wooden walls, windows with glass intact, what appeared to be a radio antenna on the roof. It was too perfect, too exactly what he needed. In some corner of his mind, Richard knew this was likely another hallucination, crueler than the others in its completeness. Still, he couldn't stop himself from moving toward it. Even false hope was better than none at all. "Hello?" he tried to call out, but produced only a cracked whisper. "Is anyone there? I need help." The station remained silent, neither responding nor vanishing. Richard pushed himself harder, ignoring the screaming pain in his leg and the pounding in his head. Just 100 more yards. Just 50. Just 20. When he was close enough to touch the wooden walls, Richard reached out with a trembling hand. His fingers passed through the solid-looking structure as if through smoke. The entire station wavered once, then dissipated entirely, leaving nothing but more empty desert. A sound escaped Richard's throat. Half laugh, half sob. Of course it wasn't real. Nothing was real except the sand, the heat, and his impending death. Collapsing to his knees, Richard stared at the spot where the phantom station had been. The cruelty of hope was worse than despair. Better to accept his fate than to keep chasing mirages. As the last of his strength abandoned him, Richard had one final vision. Jason and Frank stood together at the edge of his perception, both with their backs turned to him. He reached toward them weakly, but they were walking away. receding into the desert haze. "Don't go," Richard whispered. "Please don't leave me here alone." Neither figure responded or turned back. They continued walking until they disappeared entirely, leaving Richard truly alone for the first time since his ordeal began. Even his hallucinations had abandoned him. Richard collapsed onto his side, the hot sand burning against his cheek. This was it, then. This was how Richard Thornton, CEO of Horizon Tech, would end. Not in a boardroom or a luxury retirement, but alone in the desert, unmourned and unmissed. He closed his eyes, too exhausted to fight anymore. The roaring in his ears grew louder, drowning out his thoughts. Strange, he thought distantly. It almost sounds like... Richard's eyes snapped open. The roaring wasn't in his head. It was a mechanical sound, rhythmic and familiar, the unmistakable chopping of helicopter blades cutting through the air. With monumental effort, Richard raised his head. The sound was real, growing louder rather than fading. But in his current state, he couldn't stand, couldn't wave, couldn't do anything to signal his presence to potential rescuers. "Here," he tried to shout, producing only a feeble rasp. "I'm here." The sound grew louder still, definitely a helicopter rather than another auditory hallucination. But Richard's vision was darkening around the edges, consciousness slipping away despite his desperate attempt to hold on. His last sensation before darkness claimed him was the feeling of Frank's disappointed gaze upon him, watching as Richard Thornton finally surrendered to the desert that had broken him. The helicopter hovered over the wreckage site, its blades churning the hot desert air as the search team scanned the terrain through high-powered binoculars. Inside, Jason Thornton gripped the edge of his seat, eyes frantically searching the endless expanse of sand for any sign of his father. "There's the crash site," the pilot announced, gesturing toward the twisted metal remains of Richard's helicopter. But no movement around it. "He would have tried to walk out," Jason insisted. "My father wouldn't just sit and wait for rescue. That's not who he is." The search coordinator nodded grimly. "That's what worries me. In these conditions, walking without proper supplies is a death sentence." They had been searching for nearly 24 hours, since Richard failed to return and missed his shareholder presentation. Jason had immediately raised the alarm, pushing past corporate bureaucracy with a ferocity that surprised even himself. The initial search had located the downed helicopter, but there was no sign of Richard, only the pilot's body, still strapped in his seat. "Bank left," the coordinator instructed. "We'll sweep in a grid pattern from the crash site. If he walked, he couldn't have gotten more than 10 miles in this heat, especially injured." Jason stared at the unforgiving landscape below. How could anyone survive out there? The thought of his father dying alone in this wasteland after their last angry exchange was unbearable. Despite everything, the arguments, the disappointments, the fundamental differences in their worldviews, Jason wasn't ready to lose him. "There!" a searcher shouted suddenly. 3 o'clock, approximately 2 miles from the crash. I see something." The helicopter tilted as the pilot changed direction, descending slightly for a better view. Jason pressed his face against the window, pulse racing. Through swirling dust, a dark shape became visible against the golden sand, unmistakably human, lying motionless. "That's him." Jason's voice cracked with emotion. "That has to be him." The pilot surveyed the area. "No suitable landing zone nearby. Too many rocks. We'll have to put down about a quarter mile away and send in the ground team." "He's not moving," Jason said, fear clutching at his throat. "Why isn't he moving?" As the helicopter sought a landing spot, Richard Thornton lay unconscious, suspended in a strange liminal space between life and death. In this twilight realm, his mind had conjured its most vivid hallucination yet, a conversation with Frank Miller, not as the homeless man he'd encountered, but as the successful executive from the photograph. "Do you know why you're here, Richard?" Frank asked, sitting across from him in a space that was neither desert nor boardroom. but something undefined. I'm dying, Richard answered simply. Frank nodded. Possibly, but that doesn't answer why. A helicopter crash, a sandstorm. Bad luck. No. Frank's voice was firm. Those are how, not why. Richard considered this, his mind unusually clear in this dream space. Because I was arrogant. I ignored warnings. I thought rules didn't apply to me. Getting warmer. Frank leaned forward, but still not the real reason. Frustration flared in Richard. Then tell me. If you know so much, just tell me. You know why I'm here in your mind? Why it's me and not some other random person you've wronged? Frank gestured at the undefined space around them. You built your empire on the ruins of my life. The scene shifted, and suddenly they were in a boardroom. Richard recognized it as the old Horizon Tech headquarters before the gleaming tower was built. A younger version of himself sat at the head of the table, reviewing acquisition documents. Water Vision Technologies, the younger Richard said to his advisors. Small fish, revolutionary water purification patents. We buy them, take the IP, discard the rest. What about their employees? A faceless advisor asked. Redundant, younger Richard replied dismissively. Standard severance, nothing extra. We're buying patents, not people. The scene froze, and the current Richard stared at his younger self with growing horror. Water Vision? That was Frank's company? You never knew my name, Frank said quietly. Never looked at the human cost of your strategic acquisition. I was just a redundancy to be eliminated. That decision started a domino effect that destroyed everything I had built. The vision shifted again, showing fragmented scenes of Frank's descent, an eviction notice, a divorce filing, a funeral program for a young man named Michael Miller, Frank's son. He died while I was across the country interviewing for a job that never materialized, Frank explained, his voice hollow. By the time I got back, I'd lost my family, my home, my dignity. Eventually, I lost even my name, became just another homeless guy on the street, the kind of person you look through rather than at. Richard felt physically ill. I didn't know. I never connected. Of course you didn't. People like me aren't people to men like you. We're just obstacles or resources or problems to be managed. Frank's eyes held no anger, only a profound sadness. And that's why you're here, Richard. Not because of a helicopter crash or bad weather, because the universe sometimes demands balance. In the physical world, the rescue team raced across the sand toward Richard's prone form. Paramedics reached him first, dropping to their knees beside his sunburned, dehydrated body. He's alive, one called back to the others, but barely. Severe dehydration, probable heat stroke, infected wound on the right leg. We need to move fast. They worked with practiced efficiency, establishing an IV line to begin rehydration, covering Richard with a solar blanket to protect him from further sun exposure. His breathing was shallow, pulse thready, skin hot to the touch despite being clammy. BP dangerously low, a paramedic reported. Core temperature 104.3. We need immediate evac. Jason pushed through the medical team, falling to his knees beside his father. Dad? Dad, can you hear me? Richard showed no response, his cracked lips slightly parted, eyes closed and sunken into their sockets. Jason had never seen his father look vulnerable. Richard Thornton was always immaculate, composed, in control. This broken figure barely resembled the titan of industry who had towered over Jason's childhood. We've got him stabilized enough to move, the lead paramedic said. Let's get him to the chopper. They transferred Richard to a basket stretcher, securing him for the short journey across the rough terrain. Jason walked alongside, one hand resting on his father's arm, unwilling to break contact now that he'd found him. You found me, Jason said quietly, remembering their argument. Now I found you, we're even. In Richard's mind, the conversation with Frank continued. "Am I going to die here?" Richard asked. Frank shrugged. "That's not for me to know. I'm not really here, remember? I'm just a construction of your own conscience." "Then what's the point of all this? Just to make me feel guilty before I die?" "The point," Frank said patiently, "is that you still don't understand. This isn't about guilt. It's about seeing, truly seeing, for the first time in your life." The rescue helicopter lifted off, carrying Richard toward emergency medical care. Inside, paramedics continued working, pumping fluids into his dehydrated body, monitoring vital signs that remained alarmingly unstable. Jason sat nearby, watching the medical team fight for his father's life with the same determination Richard had always brought to business deals. The irony wasn't lost on him. His father, who valued control above all else, was now completely at the mercy of others. 3 days later, Richard opened his eyes to the sterile white ceiling of a hospital room. His first sensation was confusion, followed by the realization that he wasn't in pain. He felt disconnected, floating on a cloud of what must be powerful painkillers. Blinking slowly, he became aware of medical equipment surrounding him, monitors beeping steadily, IV tubes running into both arms, the soft hiss of supplemental oxygen through a nasal cannula. "Dad?" A familiar voice pulled his attention to the side of the bed. Jason sat there, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept much. His usual carefully styled hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled. He looked simultaneously older and younger than Richard remembered. "Jason," Richard whispered, his voice a raw croak. "You found me." "The search team did. I just pointed them in the right direction." Jason leaned forward, visibly relieved. "The doctors weren't sure when you'd wake up. Your kidneys nearly failed. Another few hours out there and you wouldn't have made it." Richard tried to sit up, but found himself too weak. "Water," he managed to say. Jason held a cup with a straw to his lips. The cool liquid sliding down Richard's throat felt like the most exquisite thing he had ever experienced. "Easy," Jason cautioned. "Small sips. Your system can't handle too much at once." Richard complied, each small swallow a reminder of how close he had come to dying of thirst. When he'd had enough, he sank back against the pillows, studying his son's face. "I'm sorry," Richard said, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. "For everything." Jason's expression softened. "Let's not do this now. You need to rest." "No." Richard reached out with a trembling hand grasping his son's wrist. "I need to say it while I still have the courage. I've been wrong, Jason, about so many things, about what matters." The door opened before Jason could respond, and a doctor entered, accompanied by a nurse. "Mr. Thornton, good to see you awake. I'm Dr. Martinez. You're a very lucky man." The medical team proceeded to check Richard's vitals, asking orientation questions, explaining the extent of his injuries and the treatment plan. Richard answered mechanically, his mind elsewhere, still partially in that strange dream space where Frank had shown him uncomfortable truths. When the medical staff finally left, promising to return in an hour, Richard turned back to his son. "There's something I need you to do for me." "Anything," Jason replied, clearly surprised by his father's uncharacteristic vulnerability. "I need to find someone, a man named Frank Miller." Richard's voice strengthened with determination. "He used to be a research director at a company called Water Vision Technologies before I acquired it. I need to know everything about him. Where he is now, what happened to him after the acquisition." Jason frowned. "Frank Miller? The homeless man from the viral video?" "Yes. It's important, Jason. More important than anything I've ever asked of you. Dad, you need to focus on recovering. The company can wait." "This isn't about the company," Richard interrupted. "This is about making something right. Please." Jason studied his father's face for a long moment. then nodded slowly. Okay, I'll see what I can find out. When the doctors came back, Richard gravitated right back to his obsession. I need my assistant to bring in files. There's research I need to do. Mr. Thornton, Dr. Martinez said firmly, you nearly died. Your body needs time to recover. I'll work from here, Richard insisted. Just a tablet, some files. I need to find someone. The doctor exchanged a glance with Jason, who shrugged helplessly. He's always been like this, unstoppable when he sets his mind to something. I can see that, the doctor replied dryly. That determination probably kept you alive in the desert, Mr. Thornton. But I must insist you limit your activities. Your kidney function is still compromised, and your leg infection was severe. Richard nodded absently, already planning his search. As the doctor left, he turned back to Jason, his voice stronger than it had been since waking. I need that you discover everything about Frank Miller, former research director of Horizon before it existed. I have to find him as soon as I get out of here. The hospital room became Richard Thornton's temporary command center, the stark white walls now covered with printouts, photographs, and news clippings arranged in a timeline that grew more extensive each day. Despite doctors' protests, he had transformed his recovery space into an investigative headquarters focused on a single subject, Frank Miller. 3 tablets sat within arm's reach on his adjustable bed tray, each displaying different information: corporate acquisition records, social media searches, and public databases. The medications dripping into his IV line may have been healing his body, but Richard's mind was consumed by this new mission with the same intensity that had built Horizon Tech. Are you sure I can't get you to look at these quarterly projections instead? Martha Chen asked, standing cautiously at the foot of his bed. As CFO, she had been running day-to-day operations since Richard's accident, and his sudden disinterest in the company was concerning. The board is getting nervous about your new priorities. Richard didn't look up from the tablet where he was reviewing Water Vision Technologies' original employee roster. The company will survive without my constant attention for a few weeks, Martha. It's been more than a week since you've even asked about the stock price, she persisted. That's not the Richard Thornton we know. He finally met her gaze, and Martha took an involuntary step back. Something had changed in his eyes, a hardness replaced by something more complex and unsettling. Maybe you never really knew me, Martha, or maybe I'm not the same person who went into that desert. Richard gestured to the timeline on the wall. Did you know that 10 years ago, when we acquired Water Vision Technologies, we laid off 73 people without a second thought? Martha shifted uncomfortably. It was a standard acquisition strategy. We wanted their patents, not their personnel. Standard, Richard repeated, the word bitter in his mouth. Yes, that's exactly what I said at the time. Standard procedure to destroy 73 lives. The door opened, and Jason entered carrying a thick folder and a cardboard beverage carrier with 3 coffees. He nodded politely to Martha. Ms. Chen, good to see you. Dad, I brought those newspaper archives you asked for and coffee for everyone. Martha accepted a cup with a tight smile. Thank you, Jason. I was just trying to get your father interested in the company again. He's interested in something more important right now, Jason replied, placing the folder on Richard's bed. Their eyes met in a moment of understanding that would have been impossible 2 weeks earlier. Martha's phone chimed with a message. She checked it and sighed. I should get back to the office. The Peterson account needs attention. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Richard, whenever you're ready to be CEO again, we'll be waiting. After she left, Jason pulled up a chair. I found those old local newspapers you wanted. Coverage of the Water Vision acquisition and layoffs. It's not pleasant reading. Richard opened the folder with reverence, as if handling historical documents of great significance. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings from a small local paper that had covered the human impact of what business publications had celebrated as a strategic acquisition. The headlines told a stark story. Local tech company gutted after takeover. 73 families face uncertain future as Silicon Valley giant shuts down research division. Former WaterVision director speaks out against corporate vultures. That last article featured a photograph of Frank Miller standing outside the former WaterVision building, looking determined despite the obvious stress on his face. The caption read, "Research Director Frank Miller vows to fight for better severance packages for his team." "He tried to protect his people," Richard murmured. "While I was celebrating the acquisition with champagne." Jason skimmed the article over his father's shoulder. "Says here he organized the former employees, filed complaints with the labor board, even tried to sue Horizon for negotiating in bad faith. Which went nowhere because our legal team buried them in paperwork and delays," Richard added, remembering the brief mention of a nuisance lawsuit in his weekly reports at the time. He had approved additional legal resources to make the problem go away, without ever learning the details. Richard turned to another clipping dated 6 months later. Former tech executive loses home after extended unemployment. The photograph showed Frank and his wife outside a small apartment, moving boxes visible in the background. "Cross-reference this with what we found yesterday," Richard instructed, pointing to his timeline. Jason nodded, consulting one of the tablets. This would be about 2 months before his wife filed for divorce and 4 months before his son's accident. Richard's research had revealed the tragic sequence that followed the WaterVision acquisition. After losing his job, Frank had struggled to find comparable employment, potential employers wary of hiring someone who had publicly challenged a powerful company like Horizon. Financial pressures had led to the loss of his home, which contributed to the dissolution of his marriage. The most devastating blow had come when Frank's 19-year-old son Michael was killed in a car accident while Frank was across the country interviewing for a position that ultimately went to someone else. By the time Frank returned home, arrangements had already been made, his absence during the crisis the final straw for his grieving wife. "Keep going," Richard said quietly, turning to the next clipping. The progression was painfully clear. Each article documented another step in Frank Miller's downward spiral: bankruptcy filing, divorce finalization, a small piece about him selling his car to pay medical bills for an unspecified condition. The final newspaper mention was barely a paragraph. Local shelter sees increase in professional men seeking services. Frank wasn't named, but the timing aligned with what they had pieced together from other sources. After that, he just disappears from the record, Jason said. No tax filings, no fixed address, nothing until he appears in that viral video outside Horizon Tech. Richard stared at the timeline they had constructed, the slow destruction of a man's life laid out in chronological order. A life that had been shattered by Richard's business decision, a decision he had made without a moment's consideration for the human consequences. "I did this," Richard whispered. "My company, my acquisition, my callous disregard for anything but profit." Jason placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, you couldn't have known." "I could have," Richard interrupted. "I chose not to. I didn't want to see the human cost because it would have complicated a clean business transaction." He looked up at his son with eyes that had seen death in the desert. "That's not an excuse, that's the problem." Richard's assistant entered with another stack of files. "Mr. Thornton, I found those employee assistance records you requested, and your physical therapist will be here in 20 minutes. "Thank you, Ellen." Richard took the files eagerly. "And please call Jameson in legal. I want to speak with him about the new program we discussed." After the assistant left, Jason raised an eyebrow. "New program?" Richard's face set with determination. "I'm implementing a comprehensive support system for people experiencing homelessness. Housing assistance, job training, medical care, starting with a focus on former employees of companies we've acquired over the years." The board will fight you on this, Jason warned. It's a significant allocation of resources with no direct profit potential. A ghost of Richard's old, confident smile appeared. Let them try. I still own controlling interest, and I've faced worse enemies than a boardroom full of directors. The smile faded as he looked back at Frank's photograph. I need to find him, Jason. I need to make this right. We'll find him, Jason assured him. The social workers I contacted think he still stays in the downtown area, usually near Westlake Park or under the Burnham Bridge. Richard nodded, then turned to a new section of their research wall. While we look for Frank, I'm making other changes. I've already instructed HR to cancel all planned layoffs. Instead, we're restructuring the affected departments to focus on sustainable technologies. Jason stared at his father in amazement. That's a complete reversal of your previous strategy. Near-death experiences tend to clarify priorities, Richard replied dryly. I've spent 20 years building a company that excels at making money. Now I want to build one that excels at making a difference. The physical therapist arrived, interrupting their conversation. As Richard was put through his paces, working to rebuild strength in his injured leg, his mind remained fixed on the timeline of destruction he had helped create, and his growing determination to reverse it. Later that evening, as Jason prepared to leave, Richard caught his arm. There's something else I need you to research. Frank had a son, Michael. I want to know everything about him, where he's buried, what he was studying, what his dreams were. Jason looked puzzled. Why? Because when I find Frank, I need to show him I truly understand what was lost, Richard explained. Not just statistics and facts, but the human reality of it all. Jason studied his father's face for a moment, then nodded. I'll find out. He paused at the door. You know, Dad, I always wanted to change the world. I just never expected you'd be the one to show me how. After Jason left, Richard returned to his research, working late into the night despite the nurses' protests. When he finally slept, he dreamed of the desert. But this time, instead of tormenting him with unreachable water, Frank Miller walked beside him, two men on a journey toward an unseen destination. The next morning, Dr. Martinez reviewed Richard's latest test results with obvious satisfaction. Your recovery is remarkable, Mr. Thornton. At this rate, we can discharge you within 3 days. Richard looked up from his tablet with newfound energy. Make it tomorrow. I have somewhere important I need to be. That's not advisable, the doctor began. I'll sign whatever waivers you need, Richard insisted. This can't wait any longer. Dr. Martinez sighed with the resignation of someone who recognized an immovable object. At least promise you'll use the wheelchair for another week. If that's what it takes. When the doctor left, Richard turned back to the latest information Jason had sent. A detailed map of areas where homeless individuals were known to gather, with notes from outreach workers who recognized Frank from his photograph. Richard picked up his phone and dialed his executive assistant. Ellen, I need you to clear my schedule for the next 2 weeks, and contact Architectural Services. I want plans drawn up immediately for converting the 14th floor of Horizon Tower into a residential and service center. As he hung up, Richard looked again at the photograph of Frank Miller from a decade ago, the successful executive with determined eyes, standing proud before his team, and then at the still from the viral video showing the same man, weathered and defeated, asking for water that Richard had refused to provide. Richard rose from his hospital bed and walked to the window, testing his recovering leg. Beyond the hospital grounds, the gleaming tower of Horizon Tech dominated the skyline, a monument to his success and the single-minded ambition that had built it. For the first time in his life, the sight filled him with something other than pride. Starting today, we're in the business of doing what's right. And my first mission is to find Frank Miller, even if I have to look under every bridge in this city, Richard said, his voice firm with newfound purpose. Richard Thornton eased his modest gray sedan into a parking space 3 blocks from the downtown shelter, deliberately choosing this unremarkable vehicle over his usual Ferrari. 4 days since his hospital discharge, and the world looked profoundly different, through eyes that had stared death in the face. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings as he adjusted the brace supporting his still healing leg. "Are you sure you don't want me to come with you?" Jason asked from the passenger seat, concern evident in his voice. Richard shook his head, reaching for the door handle. "This is something I need to do myself." He glanced at the 6-pack of bottled water on the back seat. "The shelter director said Frank sometimes comes in for dinner but doesn't stay. This might be my best chance." Jason nodded reluctantly. "I'll wait here then. Call if you need me." The shelter occupied a converted warehouse, its faded brick exterior speaking to decades of city life before its current purpose. Richard approached slowly, his injured leg still protesting despite weeks of physical therapy. He clutched the water bottles in one hand, a small offering that felt simultaneously crucial and woefully inadequate. As he entered the shelter, the institutional smell of industrial cleaner and cafeteria food hit him immediately. The large open space was divided into functional areas, dining tables to the left, a check-in desk straight ahead, and what appeared to be a common area with worn sofas and a television to the right. About 24 people occupied the space, some talking quietly, others sitting alone with vacant expressions that Richard recognized from his time in the desert. The look of people whose spirits had been worn down by circumstances beyond their control. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and practical clothes approached him. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Frank Miller," Richard said, suddenly aware of how out of place he must appear despite his deliberate choice of casual clothing. "I was told he sometimes comes here." The woman's expression shifted subtly from welcome to caution. "Are you family?" "No, I'm—" Richard hesitated. What was he? An enemy? The architect of Frank's downfall? A changed man seeking redemption? "I'm someone who needs to speak with him. It's important." She studied him for a long moment. "Frank values his privacy. Many of our, guests do." Richard nodded, understanding her protective stance. "My name is Richard Thornton. I believe he knows who I am." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "The CEO from the video." It wasn't a question. "Yes." She seemed to reach a decision. "Frank usually comes in around 6 for dinner, but he rarely stays overnight. He prefers his space under the Burnham Bridge. If you're genuinely looking to help, that's where you might find him." Richard thanked her, accepting both the information and the implicit warning in her tone. As he turned to leave, she added, "Whatever you're planning to offer him, Mr. Thornton, water, money, charity, just remember that dignity is what many of our guests miss most." Her words stayed with Richard as he drove with Jason toward the Burnham Bridge, a massive concrete structure spanning the river that divided the city's gleaming financial district from its industrial zone. Beneath its soaring arches, a makeshift community had formed, tents, tarps, and cardboard structures creating an improvised neighborhood for those with nowhere else to go. "I should have brought something more than water," Richard muttered as they parked at a safe distance. "Dad, you're bringing something more valuable than supplies," Jason replied. "You're bringing recognition, seeing him as a person, not a problem." Richard glanced at his son, struck by the wisdom that seemed beyond his years. "When did you get so insightful?" Jason smiled slightly. "Maybe I always was. You were just too busy to notice." The comment stung, but Richard nodded. "Fair enough." Approaching the encampment, Richard felt an unfamiliar emotion, nervousness. He, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, found himself uncertain how to navigate this encounter. Several residents eyed him suspiciously as he passed, his expensive shoes and watch marking him as an outsider, despite his casual clothes. "Excuse me," he said to an elderly man sorting through a shopping cart of possessions. "I'm looking for Frank Miller." The man pointed wordlessly toward the bridge's central support column, where a small blue tarp had been stretched to create a private space. Richard approached slowly, calling out before he reached the tarp. "Frank? Frank Miller? It's Richard Thornton. I'd like to speak with you." For a long moment, there was silence. Then the tarp moved aside, and Frank emerged, his appearance a stark reminder of how far he had fallen from the confident executive in the old photographs. His clothes were worn, but relatively clean, his face weathered by years of outdoor living. His eyes, however, remained sharp, intelligent and assessing as they fixed on Richard. "Thornton," Frank said flatly, "come to offer me water now that cameras are watching?" Richard flinched at the justified barb. "No cameras, just me. And yes, I brought water, but that's not why I'm here." He held out a bottle, which Frank didn't take. "Why are you here then? Guilty conscience, bad publicity hurting your stock price?" "I deserve that," Richard acknowledged. "But no, that's not it either." He gestured to a nearby concrete barrier. "May I sit? My leg is still healing." Frank's eyes flicked to Richard's brace, then back to his face. He shrugged and moved to sit on an overturned milk crate near his shelter, leaving Richard to take the concrete barrier. "I was in a helicopter crash," Richard explained, settling painfully onto the hard surface. "Stranded in the desert for 3 days. No water, no shelter, no hope of rescue." "I heard about it on the news," Frank said without sympathy. "Apparently even billionaires can have bad days." Richard nodded, accepting the verbal blow. "I deserved that too. But something happened out there, Frank. Something I can't explain." He hesitated, then continued. "I found a wrecked Jeep half buried in sand. Inside was a journal belonging to a man who died there years ago, and a photograph." Frank's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "It was you, Frank. Before all this, you worked for Water Vision Technologies before Horizon acquired it, before I acquired it." Now Frank's face registered genuine surprise. "You came looking for me because of some coincidence in the desert?" "It wasn't coincidence," Richard insisted. "I've spent weeks researching, learning what happened to you after the acquisition. The layoffs, the struggle to find work, losing your home." He paused. "Your son." Frank stood abruptly, his face hardening. "You don't get to talk about Michael, not you." "You're right," Richard conceded, remaining seated. "I just wanted you to know that I understand now what my decisions did to real people. Not numbers on a spreadsheet, not redundancies, but human beings with lives and families and dreams." "Understanding doesn't change anything," Frank replied bitterly. "It doesn't bring back my son, or my marriage, or my career." "No, it doesn't," Richard agreed quietly. "Nothing can do that, but I can offer you something else." "What? Money?" Frank's laugh was short and harsh. "Keep it. A job," Richard said. "Your old position, in fact. I'm re-establishing Water Vision Technologies as a subsidiary focused on water purification solutions for developing regions. The patents you helped develop are still viable. You understand them better than anyone." Frank stared at him in disbelief. "Is this some kind of publicity stunt? Billionaire CEO hires homeless man, film at 11? "No cameras, no publicity," Richard promised. "Just a chance to finish what you started. And housing, an apartment in the company building until you find something you prefer." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Why would I trust you? Why would I work for the man who destroyed everything I built?" "You shouldn't trust me," Richard acknowledged. "I haven't earned that. But this isn't about me, Frank. It's about the work you were doing. Work that mattered. Work that could save lives." Frank turned away, staring at the river flowing beneath the bridge. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of traffic overhead and water below. I spent 10 years hating you, Frank finally said. Not just you personally, but everything you represent. Corporate greed, unchecked power, the worship of profit above all else. He turned back to face Richard. Are you telling me you've had some miraculous change of heart because you were thirsty for a few days? 3 days without water changes a man, Richard replied quietly. But you're right to be skeptical. That's why I'm not just offering words. He handed Frank a business card. This has my personal number. When you're ready, if you're ready, call me. I'll show you what I've been working on. Frank took the card reluctantly. And what's that exactly? I've converted the entire 14th floor of Horizon Tower into a residential and training center for people experiencing homelessness, Richard explained. Priority placement for former employees who suffered from our acquisitions and layoffs over the years. We've identified 43 so far. Frank's expression remained guarded, but a flicker of interest crossed his face. That doesn't sound like the Richard Thornton I knew. That Richard Thornton died in the desert, he replied simply. He just didn't know it until now. When Richard returned to the car, Jason looked at him expectantly. Well, did you find him? Richard nodded, staring through the windshield at Frank's small shelter. I found him. Whether he'll accept my help is another matter entirely. What will you do if he refuses? Help anyway, Richard said firmly. Name the center after his son. Fund water projects in developing countries. Keep searching for others we've harmed, with or without Frank's involvement. As they drove away, Richard watched Frank in the rearview mirror, standing at the edge of his makeshift home. Business card still in hand. The gesture felt simultaneously significant and woefully inadequate, a tiny bridge across an enormous chasm of pain and injustice. 3 days later, Richard stood in the newly renovated 14th floor of Horizon Tower, surveying the transformation. What had once been executive offices now contained comfortable dormitory-style rooms, communal spaces, training facilities, and medical services. The staff, professionals in social work, healthcare, and job training, awaited the arrival of their first residents. Mr. Thornton, his assistant called from the doorway. Your 3 o'clock is here. Richard turned, expecting the program director for a final review. Instead, Frank Miller stood in the doorway, business card in hand, a small duffel bag over his shoulder. The volunteers at the shelter said you were serious, Frank said without preamble. Said you converted an entire floor of your precious tower into a homeless shelter. Not just a shelter, Richard corrected. A transition center, a new beginning. Frank looked around, taking in the extensive renovations. Why name it after my father? The Thomas Miller Center. How did you even know his name? I did my research, and it seemed fitting, Richard replied. He was a teacher, wasn't he? Someone who helped others rebuild their lives. Frank nodded slowly. I haven't decided if I'm staying, or if I trust you, or if I'm taking the job. That's fair, Richard said, extending his hand. But I'm grateful you came to see for yourself. Their eyes met as Frank accepted the handshake, his expression still guarded, but with a flicker of something new. Some people need to get lost in the desert to finally see what was right in front of them all along, Frank said quietly. Prove to me that you've really changed. The glow of sunset painted the city skyline in shades of amber and gold as Richard and Frank stood beneath the bridge where they had first truly met. 6 months had passed since that confrontation. 6 months of cautious progress, setbacks, and the slow, difficult work of rebuilding trust. The same river that had flowed beneath them then continued its journey, indifferent to the human dramas playing out above. Hard to believe this was home, Frank said, gesturing to the spot where his tarp shelter had once stood. The area had been cleared as part of a city initiative that, instead of simply displacing the homeless population, had offered real alternatives through programs like the one at Horizon Tech. Richard nodded, leaning slightly on his cane. Though his leg had mostly healed, He kept the cane as a reminder of his journey, both physical and spiritual. You could have taken the executive apartment I offered from the beginning. I needed to be sure, Frank replied simply. Words are easy. Actions take time to prove themselves. In the months since their confrontation, Richard had demonstrated his commitment through more than just the Thomas Miller Center. He had restructured Horizon Tech's acquisition protocols to prioritize employee retention, established a foundation dedicated to addressing homelessness, and quietly reconnected with his son in ways that went beyond their shared mission. Frank had approached the job offer with understandable skepticism, agreeing initially to work as a consultant rather than rejoining the company outright. His expertise had proven invaluable as they re-established the water purification projects he had begun at WaterVision years before. I spoke with the team in Ghana today, Richard said, changing the subject. The first purification system is operational, clean water for the entire village. A ghost of a smile crossed Frank's weathered face. That was always the dream. Technology that could actually save lives, not just make life more convenient for those who already have everything. Your design innovations made it possible, Richard acknowledged. The adjustments for low resource settings, the simplified maintenance protocols, those aren't things my engineers would have considered. Frank turned to face the water. Michael would have loved seeing this. He was studying environmental engineering before. His voice trailed off, the wound still raw despite the years. Richard remained silent, having learned that some grief needed space rather than words. The mention of Frank's son was significant, a sign of growing trust. For months, Michael's name had been off-limits in their conversations. I found something yesterday, Frank said after a moment, reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a creased photograph and handed it to Richard. While going through some old files the center helped recover from storage. The image showed a younger Frank standing proudly beside a prototype water filter, his arm around a teenage boy with the same determined eyes. Michael Miller, age 16, at his father's laboratory. He was brilliant, Frank continued, had this intuitive understanding of fluid dynamics that I never possessed. The modification to the filtration system that we're using in Ghana, that was based on his high school science project. Richard studied the photograph, struck by the parallel to his own relationship with Jason. You must have been very proud. I was, but I also pushed him too hard sometimes, expected too much. Frank took the photo back carefully. After I lost my job, he wanted to drop out of college to help support the family. I wouldn't let him. Said his education was more important than anything. He was driving home from university for the weekend when the accident happened. Frank continued, his voice steady but distant. If I hadn't been across the country interviewing for a job I didn't get... You can't blame yourself for that, Richard said gently. Can't I? Frank's eyes hardened. Choices have consequences, Richard. That's something you're just beginning to understand. The rebuke was fair, and Richard accepted it without defensiveness. His time in the desert had burned away the protective layers of ego and rationalization that had insulated him from the human cost of his decisions for so long. The center's opening ceremony is tomorrow, Richard said, changing the subject. I was hoping you might say a few words. Frank's eyebrow raised. About what? About second chances. About the importance of seeing people, not problems. Richard held Frank's gaze. Or about your father, if you prefer. The center bears his name, after all. The Thomas Miller Center's official inauguration would mark the culmination of the most visible part of Richard's transformation. The press would be there, along with city officials and corporate partners who had joined the initiative. But more importantly, the center's first 50 residents would be present, people whose lives had been upended by corporate decisions, including many former employees of companies Horizon Tech had acquired over the years. I'm not one for speeches, Frank demurred. Just think about it, Richard replied, not pushing further. Jason's prepared a tribute to your father that he'll present if you prefer not to speak. The mention of Jason brought another subtle change to Frank's expression. Over the past months, an unexpected bond had formed between the young man and the older one. Jason had sought Frank's perspective on sustainable technology projects, while Frank had found in Jason a receptive mind that reminded him of his own son. The relationship had evolved without Richard's direct involvement, something he viewed as a healthy sign of Frank's integration into their lives beyond the parameters Richard had initially set. As they walked back toward Richard's car, Frank paused, looking up at the Horizon Tech Tower that dominated the skyline. "You know what still bothers me?" "What's that?" "I'm not sure if you're doing all this because you've genuinely changed, or because you're trying to atone for your guilt." Frank's words were blunt, but without malice. "Does it matter?" Richard asked after a moment's consideration. "If the outcomes are the same." "It matters," Frank replied firmly. "Guilt eventually fades. Then what?" The question hung between them as they drove back to the Horizon building in silence. When they arrived, Frank declined Richard's invitation to review the final preparations for the ceremony, citing other plans for the evening. As he walked away, Richard wondered if he would actually appear at the inauguration the next day. That night, alone in his office overlooking the city, Richard found himself returning to Frank's question. Was this all just elaborate atonement? What would happen when the sharp edges of guilt wore smooth with time? The desert had changed him. That much was undeniable. But people often reverted to old patterns once a crisis passed. Would he eventually return to the single-minded pursuit of profit that had defined his career? Would this humanitarian interlude become just another corporate initiative, managed and then gradually deprioritized like so many others? Richard turned from the window and noticed the small photograph frame on his desk, the one he'd carried in his jacket through the desert ordeal. Jason at 7, grinning with his first catch, and Richard beside him, before ambition had consumed him. Beside it now stood a newer frame containing a recent picture, Richard and Jason serving water together at the Thomas Miller Center during a soft opening event for residents. The symmetry between the images struck him powerfully. His phone chimed with a message from Jason. "Final run-through for tomorrow complete. Everything's set. Dad, I'm really proud of what we're doing." Richard stared at the message for a long moment. Before his ordeal, such emotional expressions from his son would have made him uncomfortable. Now, they were the measure of success that mattered most. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for the ceremony that would officially launch the Thomas Miller Center. Media had gathered outside the Horizon Tech building, along with a mix of corporate partners, government officials, social service providers, and curious onlookers. Richard stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, watching Jason efficiently directing the final preparations. His son had taken primary responsibility for the center's implementation, revealing organizational skills and leadership qualities that Richard had never fully appreciated before. "He's good at this," a voice observed from behind him. "Better than you would be." Richard turned to find Frank standing there, dressed in a simple but dignified suit, a far cry from both the homeless man Richard had ignored and the corporate executive he had once been. "You came," Richard said, unable to hide his surprise and pleasure. "I'm still deciding about the speech," Frank replied, but there was a hint of something lighter in his expression. "I wanted to see if this was really happening or if it was all just talk." Together they watched as Jason welcomed the center's first residents, men and women of varying ages who had found themselves homeless through circumstances often beginning with job loss. Each was given a key to their own room, a symbol of privacy and dignity that many hadn't experienced in years. "I spoke with some of the residents yesterday," Frank said quietly. "Former engineers, accountants, administrative staff, people from companies Horizon absorbed. They're cautiously optimistic, afraid to hope too much." "I understand that feeling," Richard replied. The ceremony began with formal introductions and the expected speeches from officials. When the time came for Richard's address, he approached the podium with a simplicity that would have been unthinkable for the man he had been before the desert. 6 months ago, I was lost in more ways than one, he began. Physically stranded in a desert without water, but also lost in a desert of my own making. A life where profit margins meant more than people, where efficiency trumped humanity. The crowd grew silent as Richard spoke without notes, recounting not the dramatic details of his rescue, but the deeper awakening that had occurred during his ordeal. The Thomas Miller Center isn't charity, he continued. It's recognition. Recognition that our economy, our society, our very humanity depends on seeing each other not as resources to be used or problems to be managed, but as people deserving of dignity and opportunity. As Richard concluded, he gestured toward Frank in the front row. And now, if he's willing, I'd like to invite Frank Miller to say a few words about his father, Thomas, whose legacy of teaching and compassion inspired this center's mission. There was a moment of tension as all eyes turned to Frank. Richard held his breath, uncertain if the invitation would be accepted or rejected. Then, with deliberate steps, Frank rose and approached the podium. His speech was brief but powerful, painting a picture of his father, a public school teacher who had believed that education and second chances were fundamental human rights, not privileges. As he spoke, Richard noticed a subtle shift in Frank's demeanor, a return of the confidence and purpose that had been evident in those old photographs. When the formal ceremony concluded, Richard and Jason worked together serving water to the attendees, a symbolic gesture that was not lost on those familiar with the viral video that had preceded Richard's desert ordeal. As the crowd began to disperse, Frank approached with a glass of water in hand. He offered it to Richard with a look that contained too many emotions to name. Some people need to get lost in the desert to finally see the oasis that was in front of them all along, Frank said quietly as their eyes met.